The eternal play of light and reflection on the water of the Venice lagoon has romanced visitors here for centuries. Stone palaces rise miraculously from canals where boats are the only means of transportation. To see Venice is to realize a dream. But the stunning city of water is more fragile than ever today, at risk of sinking beneath waves of financial, political, and environmental exploitation. Venice, the city of light and water, is sinking slowly under the sea, crumbling under the effect of waves and mass tourism. However, scientists, activists, and entrepreneurs are trying to stem the tide of decay. One of the most important Venetian monuments being saved today is the Rialto Bridge, cracking and breaking up due to its age and heavy use. A complex €5 million renovation is being paid for by Renzo Rosso, owner of the brand Diesel Jeans.
The Rialto Bridge was an easy choice because it's one of the most important monuments in the world. It is the city I studied in, the most beautiful city I know in the world, and so it seemed to be like a good thing to make a contribution to this city that I think I belong to.
Ironically, this most romantic city of them all faces deadly threats from the very element that brought it wealth and power, the sea.
The seabed of the lagoon is getting flatter. With every passage of a ship, we lose a piece of the seabed of the lagoon, and that is a lagoon that is no longer able to resist the sea.
This city depends on the well-being and the health of its lagoon. Without the lagoon, there will be no Venice.
The Italian government has found it hard to finance urgent upkeep of its stunning cultural heritage. But private sponsors also struggle to cut through the layers of red tape necessary in order to lend a hand.
The most difficult part was the selection of contractors and getting all the quotes from each construction company. And the frustrating part is seeing that things go forward very slowly with a lot of bureaucracy.
Italy has the highest number of UNESCO World Heritage Sites of any country in the world. Entrepreneurs are throwing money at monuments to do a job that the Culture Ministry cannot afford. The Trevi Fountain in Rome, the Spanish Steps, and the greatest monument of them all, the Colosseum, are all being renovated and prepared thanks to private sector donations. The Rialto Bridge is a single span supported by thousands of wooden piles. A double row of small arched shops are crowned by higher arches that give pedestrian access to the panoramic steps along the edges. A bridge of rare beauty, it is crossed by most of the 20 million tourists that visit Venice every year. Foot traffic and the bumping of transport and travel trolleys has taken its toll on the iconic landmark. In the summer of 2011, 140 small columns that support the banister collapsed. Concerned city officials installed hundreds of sensors to measure the minuscule movements that are causing cracks in the stonework. Now the race is on to save Venice itself, already a mere shadow of its ancient glory.
I think that entrepreneurs who are successful, that have companies that make profits, ought to return part of their profits to make a contribution towards the country where they live, to their own country, and be much more socially responsible.
Quindi questa è la mia filosofia, il mio modo di pensare.
The city's wealth and decline are intimately tied to the sea. It was the sea that was the salvation for a small band of refugees fleeing the barbarian invasions. And the seafaring of its merchants was key to the vast empire that this magical city gained over the centuries. As we shall see, the decline of Venice as a state has been followed by devastating upheavals in its ecosystem that threaten to drown and choke the city simultaneously, once and for all. To understand the life and death struggle that Venice is facing, we must first understand the city's geography. The Venetian lagoon was formed 6,000 years ago as the coastal plain shifted following the Ice Age. Today, it stretches 550 square kilometers from the river Sile in the north to the Brenta in the south. The city of Venice and the smaller islands around it altogether only account for 8% of the lagoon, while 11% is permanently covered by open water and canals, 80% is mudflats, tidal shallows and salt marshes. It is one of the Mediterranean basin's largest wetlands and is in mortal danger of disappearing altogether. Laura Sabadin is a historian and guide who has watched Venice change over the years.
The struggle of Venice is not only against the pirates and the Turks, but also a struggle, or an alliance, with the environment, because the lagoon is an environment that is destined to change and evolve.
Today, new deep channels have been carved into the seafloor to enable tankers and cargo ships to reach the industrial port of Marghera and the city of Mestre. These channels and the ships that navigate them today pose a massive threat to the city's environment.
The three inlets to the lagoon, the so-called port entrances, have been excavated. They are no longer 3 or 4 meters deep as they once were. Today, they are almost 15 meters deep to allow access to larger and larger ships, cargo ships and cruise liners. Water is channeled into these deep canals, such as the so-called oil tanker channel, and the force of the water erodes, flattens the lagoon floor.
Some perceive the mega cruise liners that enter the city and sail right up to St. Mark's Square as one of the major threats to the survival of Venice and its population.
During a high-season weekend such as this, there are up to 7 of these sea monsters, floating housing blocks, floating cities. They've been described in many ways that pass through the city.
A flat lagoon surface makes flooding faster and yet more devastating. The catastrophic events known as acqua alta, high water, destroy brickwork, rot wood, rust iron, and are more and more frequent, despite the barriers nature and the Venetians have placed in their way.
This water that is displaced by the ship creates a wave that flows over the edges of the channel, and it's a real wave, with foam. A little tidal wave, a small tsunami, the effect is the same. A mass of water that moves uniformly in deep water and then meets an obstacle and rises up. This wave excavates. This wave erodes the lagoon floor.
The decline of Venice seems inevitable, as this electronic display of the city's diminishing population in a shop window close to Rialto Bridge shows. Just a quarter of its population at the height of the city's power. Venice is a miracle of engineering, which rises out of the soft mudflats of the lagoon, consolidated and expanded over 1,500 years. The story of Venice dates back to the end of the Roman Empire in the west. In the 5th century, Italy was ravaged by barbaric hordes, including the most terrible of them all, Attila the Hun. The inhabitants of the Venetian plain came here at first temporarily, and then to live permanently.
The roots of Venice go back to the barbarian invasions, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476 AD. So waves of barbarians, the Huns, the Goths, the Visigoths and the Longobards, that forced the mainland inhabitants to seek refuge, to find a hiding place in the marshlands that made up the Venetian lagoon at the time.
Un nascondiglio all'interno di zone paludose come appunto era la laguna di Venezia.
The islands were little more than mud flats, and the soil not resistant enough to support anything more than wooden huts. The very first cathedral was built here, on Torcello Island, where it was literally transported from the mainland city of Altinus in 639. The church of Santa Maria Assunta testifies to the power of the island, well before the later and more famous city of Venice became important. Soon, the inhabitants found a way of consolidating the soil enough to allow it to be built on. They began driving thousands and then millions of wooden piles, 4 or 5 meters, into the mud until they found the more solid sand and clay layers. Engineer Alberto Lionello of the Corilla Consortium of Venetian universities provides key expertise on restoring Venetian buildings.
Il problema principale per I costruttori veneziani è che
the main problem for Venice constructors was that they had to build their houses on terrain that had a very low load-bearing capacity. They could not build very deep. So they tried to consolidate this clay that was not very solid by sticking wooden piles into the earth.
Andando ad infiggere sul terreno delle palificate lignee.
Professor Guido Biscontin is a chemist and colleague.
Il terreno quindi esiste, ma è un
The terrain exists, but it is a fluid. So what all these wooden piles do is to consolidate the terrain. It's like having a chocolate pudding and putting many toothpicks in it. Both together, they contribute to the mechanical solidity, and this includes the water in our case.
Tutti e due, compresa l'acqua nel nostro caso.
The wooden poles were kept underwater, and the brackish water slowed down the process of oxidization, or rotting, while any decay in the wood was replaced by the surrounding mud, providing solidity for the foundations. The system of wooden piles, however, is fragile and uneven. The leaning church bell towers of Venice show how subsidence over the centuries has been one of the city's greatest problems. For centuries, the city of Venice held out against the invading barbarians and even the empire of Charlemagne, and remained an outpost of the Byzantine Empire.
Non esiste una data precisa.
There is no specific date by which we can say that Venice is independent. It can be assumed from a few documents, a few treaties that Venice signs, one in particular dating back to 800 AD, in which Venice is defined as an ally of Byzantium and no longer a subject.
Venice's homes and buildings evolved from simple wood structures to more solid stone as it grew more powerful and wealthy.
Inizialmente il primo insediamento è un insediamento.
Initially, the first settlement was a very simple settlement with wooden houses, huts. But after a series of major fires, there was a need to use more solid materials, and around 1300, Venice begins to change.
Venezia incomincia a cambiare il proprio aspetto.
Le fondazioni delle case in particolare.
The foundations of the houses that give onto the canals, but also the internal ones, were reinforced. I don't know if this is the right term, inserting between 8 to 10 piles per square meter that solidified the mud which otherwise would have moved.
La lunghezza di questi pali è variabile tra 1 metro e
The length of these piles was variable between 1.5 meters and 3 meters, so the situations are different throughout the city. In any case, on top of this palisade, they placed horizontal planks called madieri, a word that comes from shipbuilding, which distribute the weight evenly over the wooden piles.
Perché richiamano, diciamo, la costruzione delle navi che sostanzialmente distribuiscono il carico uniformemente su questi pali di legno.
The wooden piles were covered with a wooden floor, on which impermeable marble was laid, which formed the foundation of the buildings. A brick base could then be laid on top of that, and another marble base on top of that again, on which the buildings could grow in height. Architect Enrico Rinaldi has examined the structural characteristics of the Venetian houses.
Una delle cose caratteristiche.
One of the characteristics of the Venetian palace, as compared with palaces of other cities of the same period, is that they have two access points. One access point from the canal and one from the land side. This is very important with regards to all the architectural characteristics of the houses and the urban layout.
Dell'architettura ma anche dell'urbanistica di Venezia.
To protect the brick and wood superstructures from damage by humidity and seawater, a damp course made of highly impermeable Istrian marble was used to isolate the upper parts of the buildings from rising damp.
Le case veneziane sono state costruite.
The Venetian houses were built taking into account the average sea level of the time. So they created a protection layer, inserting stones that were water resistant.
In pietra che non permettono la risalita dell'acqua.
Another resistant material was used to pave the most important streets of the city. Volcanic trachyte from the Euganian hills, which is resistant and when worn down remains rugged and robust.
This trachyte is very good. It isn't slippery, it's compact, and there are 1.5 million square meters of paving made of it.
1 milione di metri quadri di pietra di pavimentazione.
In the 11th century, Venice profited from being the crossroads of trade between the rich Asian markets, mostly silk and spices, and the new nobilities of medieval Western Europe. By the year 1000, with a precarious peace established between the two empires that ruled Europe, the city built a trading empire of its own. Venice enjoyed a unique geographical position and exploited what was then the fastest mode of transport in the world, the ship. Today, tourists pay up to $100 an hour to ride in a gondola and experience one of the city's most ancient traditions.
Sai, Venezia è una città, nasce dall'acqua.
It's a city that rises from the water. It comes out of the water. You can't compare it to any other city. Then there's the sound of the water and what we call la bavetta, a little breeze in the evening that makes it all the more magic, like a fairy tale.
Gondolas are still built in a few boatyards dotted around the city, such as this one, where an old gondola is in need of repair after many years in the water. Strangely, the gondola does not have a straight keel, as it has to compensate for the weight of the gondolier standing on the left side, with a single oar on the right side providing propulsion.
They're asymmetric. The gondola you see today is the modern gondola, based on a late 19th, early 20th century design. It's asymmetric, with the right side lower than the left side. So it's the same principle as the sailing boat, because since the right side is lower, the gondolier stands on the left, so the gondola is balanced out.
Essendo la parte destra più bassa, il gondoliere sta a sinistra e quindi si bilancia la gondola.
Famed as the most romantic form of transport, gondolas ply the salt waters of the lagoon for years and inevitably deteriorate. They are sent to workshops like this one to be restored. Another characteristic that the city has kept from the time of its mercantile past is the specialty glass-making on the island of Murano. The temperatures in this craft glassworks of the glassmaster Gianni Seguso reach 50 degrees Celsius on a cool day. The furnaces reach up to 1,000 degrees. This traditional glassmaker is using ancient techniques to make quality glass objects. Sandy glass melts at over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Any colouring is added in the furnace itself. Blobs of glass can be taken out and moved to another furnace or worked directly by the artisan using pincers, blowpipes and other instruments exploiting the natural viscosity of the glass to best effect. These techniques go back to the 15th century, when Venice was at the height of its glory and Venetian tableware adorned the banqueting tables of the kings and queens of Europe. Venice itself had no monarchy. However rich the merchants became, no single family ever dominated the city, which instead developed its own form of democracy. In Venice, the growth of industry and trade distributed wealth among the rich merchants who came up with a unique form of government. The inhabitants of the island developed an electoral system for their leader, the Doge, ancient Venetian for duke, who usually ruled for life, like a pope of today. He was elected by a council of 2,000 inhabitants, rich and poor, and ruled with a council of 10. It was a system that worked for 1,000 years. The political life of the city unfolded here, in the Doge's palace, where a magnificent staircase leads up to the council hall.
Tutti i mercanti ricchi che già si erano avvicendati.
All the rich merchants who had already shared power among themselves became part of an elite, a caste, all with the same rights, equal rights. And this avoided internal strife, so guaranteed stability and peace.
Questo impedì lotte intestine e quindi stabilità e pace.
Venice and Constantinople were cities that both depended on and profited from their strategic positions on the sea, in an era when ship transport was the fastest and safest. The old allies were destined to become bitter rivals. In April of 1204, the Republic's greatest trading partner, became the victim of Venetian greed.
Venezia decide di
Venice decides to use the Fourth Crusade to its own advantage. During the voyage along the Adriatic coast, the son of the Byzantine emperor calls for help because his father has been deposed. So the Venetians, the Crusaders, accept the proposal. But the Byzantine emperor does not keep his promise, and the Venetian Crusaders attack Constantinople.
The man who led the Crusaders was Commander Enrico Dandolo, who would die in Istanbul and is buried here in Hagia Sophia, where today hundreds of tourists walk by his remains daily. In the three-day massacre, Crusaders ravaged the great city, stealing works of Byzantine art and pillaging the hippodrome, which no longer has its 4 precious horses. They were carried off to Venice and today adorn the Cathedral of St. Mark. Ironically, the cornerstone of the cathedral is a statue representing the emperors of the Eastern and Western Roman empires embracing. Constantinople never recovered from the 1204 attack, but Venice thrived. The city's wealth is represented by some of the great houses along the Grand Canal. While elsewhere in Europe, rich traders and lords were building castles, the Venetians were constructing these large palaces, which were both stores and homes. The ground floor was the traders' warehouse, and boats came right up to the big gates to unload their merchandise into the storeroom. The house owner lived on the first floor, the so-called piano nobile, and the servants' quarters were at the top in the attic. Typically, there were 2 flights of stairs that ran up and down the house, one hidden for the servants and the other public. They crossed at least one point so that the servants could access the owner's living quarters. Since the bearing walls of each building were perpendicular to the canal, the floors were of light wood and internal walls of plaster. The typical Venetian house has its origins around 800 or the year 1000, and then evolves with little variation. It is essentially made up of a series of floors, of which one is directly in contact with the water. Then there is an upper floor, and there might sometimes be a mezzanine, with lower ceilings than the others. Then there's the main floor, or piano nobile, and then one or more floors above that. The Venetian facades were an elaborate and beautiful display of wealth, a testimony to the financial power the city was accumulating. But they also made architectural sense.
The
load-bearing walls were placed only where there was a safe base, and they tried to make the buildings as light as possible. The hole for the window reduced the surface, and therefore the weight of the wall. That's why, here in Venice, you see half of the facades are covered, and half are made up of windows. Unlike the seats of power of the rest of Europe, the Doge's palace here has an open facade. So this engineering necessity also gave the convenient impression of political transparency. The first example we see in Venice is the Doge's palace, which, apart from having many windows, is open with a system of porticos, so as to lighten the weight on the foundations. This is another characteristic of the Venetian palaces.
Maybe the main characteristic of Venice is that the buildings are built upwards. in such a way that they can withstand the different rates of subsidence of the different structural elements. That is a typical Venetian characteristic.
Ed è lì forse la caratteristica tipica veneziana.
Today, the wooden piles of the city are being examined to shed light on the state of the very foundations of the buildings that make Venice what it is.
Se un palo perde di sezione, non è che rimane vuoto, ma
If a pile loses some of its substance, it doesn't remain empty, but is filled in with more mud, mud that may be more liquid. So the system can't simply collapse in the sense of one day standing and the next falling down, but it will give us signs. And when there are signs in the older brickwork, then we need to take a look at the situation of the pile, which we did, I think, on the church towers of Santo Stefano and the Frari Church.
di Santo Stefano e dei Frari, mi pare. Ecco.
Venetians explored the Near and Far East and brought home exotic goods to sell on the European market for huge profits. Wealthy merchants, like Marco Polo, built imposing, ornate palaces that still stand today.
Lo stesso viaggio di Marco Polo che
Marco Polo's journey that lasted more than 3 years was very adventurous, by ship, on foot, on camelback, on horseback.
Cammello, cavallo.
After the plundering of Constantinople, Venice did not disdain war as a means of controlling trade routes. The massive arsenal of Venice is where the Doge's warships were built. In the 15th century, as many as one ship a day came off the production line here. Venice was the first European state to control a trade empire. When, in 1453, the Turkish army captured Constantinople, Venice was quick to do a deal and build an even more exclusive trading partnership with the new Muslim rulers. The high tide mark of Venetian power came with the victory of the Catholic states against the Turkish fleet at Lepanto, marking a turning point in relations with the Ottoman sultans.
Rimanevano lontani dalla loro Venezia per lunghi periodi proprio per
They remained far from their Venetian homes for long periods, so as to be present when the precious goods arrived from the east. They were also present in Persia, not only along the Mediterranean coast. They were very adventurous, but once they had bought the merchandise was accompanied or sent back to Venice to be sold in their stores in the palazzi or in the Rialto market.
Nei fondaci, nei palazzi o nel mercato di Rialto.
As the buildings of Venice went up, they consolidated the banks of no less than 124 islands, and soon the inhabitants found the need to build bridges. There are more than 400 bridges in the city of Venice, but one of them is the most famous of them all, perhaps the most famous in the world. The Rialto Bridge we see today was built between 1588 and 1591 as a permanent stone-built replacement for the previous wooden drawbridge. Spanning 28 metres, the bridge was designed with a clearance of 7.3 metres to allow the passage of galleys. It was built on 12,000 wooden piles that still support it today. In 1551, a competition was held to design the new bridge, and some of the Renaissance era's most famous artists and architects, including Palladio and Michelangelo, submitted blueprints. The job went to Antonio da Ponte, who built this single-arch bridge lined with shops, an extension of the Rialto market. For centuries, it was the only crossing place on the Grand Canal. In 2013, the City Council commissioned a report that revealed that the bridge, while not at risk of collapse, has indeed sunk 25 centimetres since Da Ponte first built it. City officials approved a €5 million restoration project, funded by fashion mogul Renzo Rosso, president of the OTB Group, which owns the diesel fashion brand, among others. In exchange for his donation, the scaffolding covering the bridge during the renovation will display billboards advertising Rosso's brands. He dismisses criticism that the sponsorship was a publicity stunt.
In our case, there is little, let's say, little interest in exploiting this operation, because if you consider that we spend 5 million, we might recover in the order of 500,000 in terms of promotion that we can account for as advertising of our brands. So it's more a form of patronage to do something for the city.
In the Renaissance, wealthy individuals became patrons of art. Merchants and guilds bought paintings to show off their power. Not only the nobles, but also the merchants came together to provide mutual support groups, known as scuole, or guilds, that provided vital social cohesion. They were the city's middle class.
By the term scuole, or school, we mean a system of guilds that were present all over Europe around the 1200s and then spread. So these associations gathered contributions from their members, as well as donations from rich families, to offer a system of mutual assistance.
Per poter offrire un sistema di mutuo soccorso.
The professional and ethnic communities came together to help the poor and sick, and the city displayed remarkable tolerance towards foreigners and their associations.
Venice would be home to about 200 of these guilds, most of them connected to the crafts, others linked to specific ethnic groups, such as the Guild of Albanians, the Guild of the Greeks, the Guild of Dalmatians.
Among the most needy in the city were the plague victims, who were quarantined on islands in the lagoon, such as this one, Lazzaretto Nuovo. The large building in the center acted as a fumigation hall for goods coming into the lagoon, quarantine for the imports. The patron saint of plague victims is Saint Roch, and the Guild of San Rocco was created to provide aid to the sick.
The confraternity of Saint Roch, which we see behind me, is one of the last of the guilds to be founded, as it was built in 1478 with a specific task: to help people in general, of course, but specifically to help plague victims.
At a time of great religious fervour, possessing the relics of a saint was the source of great power and provoked enthusiastic donations from the faithful.
A few Venetians managed to capture, to steal, no one knows from where, the body of Saint Roch. The church is built, and the number of members grows exponentially.
In maniera esorbitante.
In 1516, just a few years after the guild was founded, the time came to decorate the new building. The Guild Commission called on the great artists of the time to compete for the contract. The egocentric Jacopo Tintoretto took all by surprise and won the bid in a typical Renaissance drama.
Jacopo Tintoretto fa cadere delle tele dal soffitto.
Jacopo Tintoretto has curtains dropped from the ceiling that was being prepared, and this oval with Saint Roch in glory appears, already finished and placed. This provokes a very harsh reaction, but Tintoretto defends himself immediately, saying, "But I am devoted to Saint Roch, and this is a gift." So they voted, and they decided to accept Tintoretto's gift, and even asked him to proceed to decorate the whole hall.
Gli si chiederà di procedere con l'intera decorazione della sala.
The great artists of Venice of the 15th and 16th centuries adorned the churches and public places of the city, such as the Frari Monastery, where Titian left two masterpieces.
Io direi che per quanto riguarda Venezia,
I would say that as far as Venice is concerned, it is the powerful that seek out the artist. Power is represented by a class of patricians, a cultured class, who recognize beauty when they see it, identify works of art, seek it to ensure they own it.
le opere.
The city prided itself on its religious tolerance too. The Bridge of the Greeks and the Church of St. John Chrysostom testify to the presence of Orthodox Greek merchants. Muslim, Protestant and Jewish communities intermingled and traded. Today, the synagogues and narrow streets of the old Jewish ghetto attract many visitors. But foreign and local commerce could only thrive if Venice's hundreds of access canals were kept free of silt. The lagoon is a metre deep on average. It is a delicate ecosystem and requires a balance of hydrogeological and natural factors to keep it healthy. When the city was founded, it looked like this. Over the years, however, the sandbanks on the Adriatic side of Venice built up with silt from the rivers.
Verso il 1500 ci fu addirittura
Around the 1500s, there was a change in policy with investments on the mainland, and it's around the 1500s that we see the first villas, which are farms, with investments in the land.
When Venice gained a foothold on the mainland, the city's rulers were able to divert the rivers that were silting up the lagoon. From the mid-16th century onwards, a series of canals and dikes changed the course of the two major waterways that led into the lagoon, the Brenta and the Sile. The lagoon began to consolidate its shape and form, making it what we see today. Occasionally, a high tide flooded the city, but only since the late 20th century has the so-called acqua alta become a mortal danger. The biggest threats to the city's physical survival were developed in the 20th century: the oil tanker, the cruise ship, and the outboard engine, which, together with the petrochemical industries of the mainland and global warming, are literally drowning Venice. While the slow death of the city of Venice began in the late 20th century, its decline as an independent state was already underway in the 1700s. The height of Venetian glory is a thing of the past. Today, it is a fading beauty, still stunning, but slowly sinking into the sea.